and welcome to our last lecture on Modernism, 1900 through World War I. So with Expressionism, I want you to think emotion, where they're trying to express their emotions and have you react emotionally as well. So we're based in Germany here. We have two groups of Expressionism. The the Bridge, formed in 1905, and this is primarily in Dresden, so they're different geographically. Founders are Kirchner and Nold, and their idea is that this art shall be the bridge between the old and the new. We're in the modern era, we're throwing out the academic style, and so they're using color and form to express their feelings about this, their worldview. And we'll see how this also plays out with World War I. And then we have the Blue Rider, Der Blaue Reiter, formed in 1911, a little later. And this is more in Munich by Wassily Kandinsky and Franz Marc. We're going to begin with a member of this group, Paula Modersohn. She was a member of the Bridge group, Die Brücke, and her self-portrait with an amber necklace. So we've seen numerous nudes within art history. However, what we're seeing here is Modersohn Becker pretty much, she almost single-handedly invented a new genre in European modern art. The nude female self-portrait. We've seen self-portraits, we've seen nude females, but they've been done by males in the context of the male gaze, for men to be looking at them. I remember that was part of the criticism even during the end of the realism period, whenever Manet was showing his work, where it was just a bunch of nudes for the male gaze. Where here we have Paula taking control of this, essentially. This is a time when European women are demanding change and demanding more social and political independence. And so we see that sense of independence with her own self-portrait, and where she is seen confidently posing for herself. This isn't sexual in nature. It's not for the male gaze. There's no allegory or larger meaning to this. Instead, she is taking control of the female nude. And so this changes the art world. She shows the female body as is versus, let's say, our good old Aphrodite, where this originates from. The female body looks idealized, where she is showing asymmetry, even with like her breasts, etc. So she's showing the female nude as the female nude, and she's appreciative of this. She becomes known for her depictions of children, and we see here pregnancy and this acknowledgement of the body changing and the role of females, but also she's celebrating these roles. She often has this amber necklace on. There's some arguments about these healing powers of amber, but that's a common motif in her nude self-portraits. So again, she changes the history of art in that regard, where she creates it from a female and confident in herself and in her body. And so it's this really introspective quality here. It's these psychological depictions where she feels confident and secure in her own body. Okay, here is Wassily Kandinsky. He is part of one of the founding members of the Blue Rider group. He is Russian. He is living in Germany. And we can thank him for essentially being the first abstract artist. We've seen the distortion of forms and the rejection of illusionism, but here we're seeing pure abstraction. So what we need to also understand about Kandinsky is he had synesthesia. So this is where neurologically, whenever someone with synesthesia hears music, they see colors. We're at a time period where not only is the status quo of art being challenged in the Academy of Art, but also all these other artistic schools, be it music, etc., literature, poetry. Society is changing tremendously. The old norms seem to be disintegrating, and so they're also challenging other fields. And so we have brand new music that's challenging the norms being composed during this time period. And Kandinsky is really influenced by this new music. And so we see numerous paintings, some are even called compositions, where he is painting what he sees when he hears this music. So he's really the first modern abstract artist. So he often even compares his art to music, where he's spontaneously painting these, just as music can sometimes sound spontaneous. He also wants art to have an emotional impact on us. He wants, like, the way how music can wash over you and affect you. He wants art to wash over what you and affect you. So he's interested in the expressive matter of art. He's really intellectual. He's wanting to remove the materialism of art, in terms of rejecting illusionism and naturalism and realism. It's not about the objects, but instead the effect on the viewer. He wants art to help awaken the human spirit, and we can see that in his art. Some have argued that there's a theme, of the apocalypse and salvation, and that the left, the more chaotic scene, has to do with the apocalypse, whereas salvation is on the right with this supposed church on a hill. We also have figures throughout this artwork to an extent. Like this, some have argued, is the profile of the figure, eyelids and lashes, an open mouth. But regardless, it's extremely abstract. And so he's using color in an expressive manner to try to awaken the human spirit. So here's Ernst Kuchner, Street Dresden, and he was one of the founding members of the Bridge of Die Brücke. He's reacting to the changes in modern society, industrialization, urbanization that our other artists have been reacting to in various ways. Now let's think of Matisse and how he used color and the complementary colors of pink and green to encourage tranquility and contemplativeness in the viewer. He wants them to contemplate peace and serenity and feel balanced, and he uses the complementary colors to create a balanced artwork in that regard. He's using color. The Expressionists were really inspired by the Fauvists. They liked their bold use of color, so we see that with Kirchner here. But let's compare how he too is using the complementary colors of purple and green. But look at how disconcerting this is. Look at this yellowish green here. And this busy, crowded area makes us feel uncomfortable. And then this child, almost centrally placed, surrounded by this pink, so our eyes are drawn toward her, this negative space around her, seems to be alone. And is she lost? Is this person getting her? Is he trying to move her out of the way of this trolley that's oncoming? So there's this sense of danger, and it's uncomfortable. And so these colors are used in a different way and to express the inner thoughts of Kirchner and his views of these changes in society in a more negative aspect. Here we have up close. So they really like the bold colors of Fauvism. You can see where they were inspired by that. And then we have World War I. World War I, 1914 to 1918. So if I were to ask you what are the reasons for World War I, you likely wouldn't have a definitive answer, a vague answer about some assassination of some Austro-Hungarian person. And the reason why you can't explicitly state it is because there essentially, most historians can argue there isn't really a good reason for it. Old powers without really too much rhyme or reason and didn't realize the extent of destruction they would cause. And so think of the criticisms of these new factory-made items, et cetera, the idea of industrialization and factory production, et cetera. And now that is taken to the extreme where we have weapons of mass destruction. This grand homicide on such a global scale as being produced out of this industrialization. And so, of course, we're going to see artists react to this. There were about 20 million people who died in World War I. A lot of death. Many of our artists during this time period actually die. Those who are in Europe serve in the war and don't come back. It should also be noted, especially coming later, is the Spanish flu, the flu of 1918. More people died of the Spanish flu than they did in combat. So pretty much a year, about 50 million people died of the Spanish flu. And it hit people at their peak. So these young men who were off to war in their prime physical condition, in their early 20s and whatnot, were the ones who were hit the hardest, more than any other age group. Now, the reason why it's called the Spanish flu is because all these other countries who were involved in the war, it was made illegal for anyone to report about or talk about the Spanish flu because they thought it would bring down morale for the war. Spain they were having their own political issues, so we'll get into that in the next unit, is they were not involved in the First World War. And so their reporters were the only ones who talked about it. So that's why it was called the Spanish flu, because they were the only ones reporting it. So there's a lot of death during this time period, and our artists react to that. And so here we have Kirchner, Self-Portrait as a Soldier, 1915. A couple of years before this, about 2 years before this, Die Brug, the bridge, had disbanded, various reasons. We have a war that begins. Numerous members of Expressionism are killed in this war. And Kirchner actually volunteers to serve in the German military, but he's discharged for health reasons, and he paints this when he returns home. And so we see the terror of warfare come through this, the PTSD of it. These hollow eyes with nothing there, the hollowed out skin, the sagging face, this distortion of the bodies. I should have pointed that out with the other, his other street, Dresden, where form is especially distorted to be expressive. And so here we have this uncomfortable depiction of him after he's returned from war. So the angular forms of the faces arguably are influenced by these African masks that have made their way into Europe, just like we talked about with Picasso and his Les Damoiselles. But he's also depicting his fears, his terror from before entering the war. This loss of a limb is not accurate. He did not lose his hand, but it's more of a reflection of his fear of losing his hand or losing his ability to create art. And where he came back from war and it was more difficult. These men are returning home in what's first described as shell shock. They're in extreme PTSD. And we can see that within this painting and this ghastly elongation and of forms, even with like his other hand where it's pointed and it's uncomfortable. And he's using color to express this inner torment. It's quite angular. Here's a picture of him in his studio. Self-portrait. Now, unfortunately, Kirchner doesn't have a good ending. When the Nazis gained control by the early 30s, they essentially, under Hitler, only the academic style was allowed. So all of these challenges to the status quo and these new movements were pretty much outlawed, and they held the Degenerate Art Exhibition. So when you have an assigned resource over that, where they had essentially every style that was present in Germany by all these artists, those who were living and those who passed away, and he puts them on display and then afterward destroys them all. All of Kirchner's artworks were, or at least the ones that were available, were part of this exhibition. And he was so humiliated by this, being a part of this degenerate art exhibition, that he shortly committed suicide afterward. So another victim of the Nazi regime, unfortunately. Okay, let's talk about Suprematism and Kazimir Malevich. So this is 1915. The war has begun. We are in Russia. So if you'll remember from the East Asia unit and that assigned resource over the Russian Revolution, which I reposted, communism and the ideas of communism had been around for a little while. This criticism of the Russian Empire and the king has been going on for quite some time. So much so that Lenin had been removed from or exiled from Russia. And at the beginning of World War I, to discourage Russian involvement in the war, the British pretty much snuck Lenin back into Russia to ignite this revolution. So 2 years from now, we have this revolution. But the ideas are still really present. It's already been stirring. And that Kazimir Malevich is a part of this. Like many people who want out with the old and in with the new, and definitely are right in demanding better treatment of everyone outside of royalty, because the vast majority of Russia is suffering greatly. And so as part of this, there's this rejection of the institution of the academic style, of the norm, of the status quo, like what we've seen elsewhere. In 1913, trying desperately to liberate art from the ballast of the representational world, I sought refuge in the form of the square. Kazimir Malevich. And so he creates this style called Suprematism. He created this abstract style to convey his belief that supreme reality in the world is pure feeling. So consider how other artists have tried to determine how to look at the world, be it appreciating history or like the realists looking to just what's present right here and right now, and how art can be used to show their worldview and encourage a change in other people's worldviews. Well, Malevich sees reality as being just pure feeling. And so he thinks that the purity of the square reflects that. To the suprematists, the visual phenomena of the object world are, in themselves, meaningless. The significant thing is feeling, as such, quote, apart from the environment in which it is called forth. Essentially what he's saying is, by suprematism, I mean the supremacy of pure feeling in creative art. And so this is also influenced by these communist ideas and this rejection of the academic style and the rejection of the status quo, where we have a primarily illiterate society in Russia during this time period. And so he's saying all the art that's been produced, only those who have been a part of the elite can understand it. So he wants to create an art that anyone can understand, whether they have any education, whether they're illiterate or not, whether they've had any exposure to art. And so he believes that these extremely just solid geometric forms with basic colors, such as the rectangle, the square, and the line, can speak to anyone on any level, no matter their background. And so he says that this is purity, that this is reality. And here's a 1915 exhibition of his artwork. And he's reacting to the loss of this war and the loss in Russia, and everything which we loved is lost. We are in a desert. Before us is nothing but a black square on a white background. This was originally darker. The cracks have appeared over time because it's oil on linen, so it wasn't originally like that. Now, he too, unfortunately, is part of the regime of communism that comes about, and how all of these different schools of thought, be it artists, but poets and literature, writers and literature and musicians, and they all think that with this turning over of the old world order, that they're going to get together and be creative and create this new world order with these new ideas. Well, what happens is you have another dictator that comes in and a regime, and instead they too create their own form of art, that communist art that we've studied, and they reject everything else. And so Malevich's work is one of those that are rejected. The creative types are essentially sent off or just have to go into the shadows because they're rejected by this new regime. So there's Malevich. Talking about World War I, let's talk about Dada. This is a precursor to Surrealism. It stems out of the Dada movement. It's from 1915 to the mid-1920s. So these artists are essentially reacting to the homicide of World War I. We've already seen art movements that are reacting against the industrialization, urbanization, the changes in society, etc. And so, like I said, those elements of that with these mass-produced factory goods are now being used to create weapons of mass destruction, which result in the death and killing of 20 million people. And these people are returning home shell-shocked, PTSD. And so Dada is reacting to all of this. They even create a manifesto, but it's pure nonsense. They basically say everything we knew about society caused this destruction. So all of it is meaningless. The only thing that's real is nonsense. And so they create this nonsensical art. They're disgusted with war. And so they have this undercurrent of humor and whimsy to counterbalance that. We can see, and they're looking to the emergence of Freud and Jung and psychoanalytical views that are coming about. So they're looking to the subconscious, and we see that, of course, play out with the surrealists next. But essentially, they're creating this nonsensical art, and they're challenging everything. So they're using, here's performance art, it's nonsense. I should say also the title Dada is supposed to represent like baby babble, like a first word, Dada, Dada, of this new world. Everything that they knew about their world has been pulled out from under them, so they're starting fresh and new like a baby. And it's supposed to be nonsensical babble. But we have these combinations of different objects and materials and collages. They're departing from traditional media here. We have cutouts and combinations. And then we have Marcel Duchamp's fountain. This is a copy, 1915. The original was lost. Original from 1917. And so we have a new term here, ready-made. So there was an interview in, I want to say like the late 1990s and maybe early 2000s. They interviewed these people who worked at many museums, but not the curators. Talking about like the guards and the more everyday people who worked at museums. And they were asked, what's the one work of art that from the 20th century that changed everything? And the most common answer was Marcel Duchamp's fountain. And so here we have a complete rejection, essentially, of everything we know about art. This is a ready-made object. So he bought this object. He has no hand in it other than this black paint signature here, and claims it as art. The first time I was taught about this art object in my survey class in college was that he explicitly was trying to challenge the art norms, that he did this purposefully with intention and planning. But then when I was in San Francisco, where this was shown at the museum in which it's housed, the wall text said that he had actually put this entry for a joke. Like he submitted this entry for this art exhibition as a total joke, mocking things. So there's obviously a little bit of discrepancy with the origin story, but either way, it changes the art world. Either way, it challenges these norms. Have you figured out what it is by now? So it is a urinal, hence the play on fountain. So he's bought this ready-made object. He has turned it on its back. So here's where you would screw it into the wall. Here's the piping or connection to the piping. And he's put it in a different position. It was made by J. Mott, this company. He signs this Mott, 1917, and calls it art. So his hand isn't even in it, essentially. Neither is his name. So it challenges everything about art. It's part of this Dada movement, this nonsense, the destruction of the world has resulted in the destruction of what we think art is. So he's challenging what is art. Duchamp is actually a part. So this was a submission for this exhibition in the realm of challenging the status quo, of new ideas, of encouraging that. There was this exhibition in which the idea was that everyone who submitted an entry would be on display, every artwork. There's technically a jury, but the idea was still they would be submitted. And Duchamp submitted this under a false name, Armut. He was somehow associated with this exhibition. And he submitted it, and the jury actually rejected it. And later it becomes, talks about it, and it becomes part of the art museum, and this in a couple versions are on display now. But it does change the art world. So this ready-made object, this absurdity of a urinal being in a fine art institution. What is the world? What is society? What are we as humans when we're capable of such destruction? What is art? And so this changes everything, like many artworks that we've looked at.